Good evening, everyone. My name is Fadi Masoud. I'm an assistant professor of landscape architecture at the Daniels faculty. I'm here to welcome you all to this evening's talk, Distancing Density, and it's my privilege to welcome Dean Rob Bright to open the ceremonies, if you will, and do the land acknowledgement. Go ahead, Rob.
Hello, everybody. It's such a great pleasure to see you all. First, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And we honor the elders not only here, but on all the different areas of land from which you people might be participating. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rob. So before introducing our guest, I'll provide a brief intro for tonight's theme, Distancing Density. Our cities have changed radically in the last 50 years. Now, most of our low-income residents and racialized minorities live in the inner suburbs where the value of downtown's density and its supportive amenities are far beyond reach. The current pandemic highlights this mismatch and calls into question our biases as designers and planners that perpetuate this imbalance. As you'll see tonight, both Jay Pitter and Dan Dioka have keen insights about this theme, albeit from slightly different disciplinary perspectives, and we're pleased that they're both able to join us tonight. So I'll introduce Jay. Jay Pitter is an award-winning placemaker whose practice mitigates growing divides in cities across North America. She spearheads institutional city building projects, specializing in public space design and policy, forgotten densities, mobility equity, gender responsive design, inclusive public engagement, and healing fraught sites. She is a co-editor of Subdivided, City Building in an Age of Hyperdiversity, and her forthcoming books, Black Public Joy and Where We Live, will be published in 2021. Welcome, Jay.
I'm going to introduce Daniel Dioka, who is an associate professor in practice in urban planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a principal and co-founder of Interboro Partners, a New York-based architecture, urban design, and planning firm that has won many awards for their participatory and place-based projects. Dan has also, as part of his firm, published a book titled The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion, which was published in 2017. Welcome, Dan and Jay, to this evening's talk. First off is Daniel. I think you're gonna share your screen. Okay, go.
Eventually, and I'm actually going to start by just talking a little bit. Thank you all. I'm really happy to be here, and been really looking forward to this discussion for a while. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I hope everyone is healthy and safe. I know that people have other things on their minds in this strange time that is maybe stranger if you are like me, based in the United States. So first off, I just want to acknowledge that, the brief notes that for some, the pandemic is an opportunity to double down on bike lanes, parks, and what have you, but needless to say, it's a luxury to have the opportunity to really think of this pandemic as an opportunity. A luxury, by the way, that I have, given my relative position of privilege here in upstate New York, where our COVID numbers are thankfully quite low. Speaking of the brief, there are some slippery terms in there, right? Terms that are notoriously difficult to define. Density, for one. On the one hand, it just means the number of units in an area, which sounds simple enough. It's not. Measuring density is not easy. For starters, what is the unit? Are we measuring people? Are we measuring buildings? Building density definitely does not mean population density. We could be measuring, downtown that has no housing or a mixed-use neighborhood. What's the area, right? Are we looking at the region? Is it a city-wide measure of density or the neighborhood? Where do we draw the boundary? This will obviously influence the density level. Is it a gross measurement that includes, water and unbuildable areas, right? Or is it a net measurement? Density inside of a city can be very varied, obviously. So there's, in any city, obviously there's pockets of intense concentration, there's islands of thin settlement and so forth. Another question, when are we measuring? Is it in the daytime when people are at work? Is it at night? Who are we counting? Residents, of course, but of course we can't just count residents. In fact, my colleague, Ann Forsyth, has written an essay about measuring density and identified, in fact, 20 different ways that density is measured. So how dense, a city, a region is, it's going to depend on what is measured and how it's measured. So that is to say that this is a tough thing to talk about, because when we talk about it, we're often talking about different things. To the extent that we can agree how to measure it, we sometimes disagree about what consequences it has and whether we should or should not privilege it, to go to the brief. Does density, say defined as persons per acre, spread disease? That's a good place to start. Obviously a very important line of inquiry right now. Governor of New York once thought it did. Others disagreed. The latest data suggests that overcrowding is a likelier culprit, which again is a very different thing than density, even when density is defined as persons per acre. So an area, with 10 units per acre could have, 15 people in it, if that's a place of empty nesters and seniors, right? So, so I would say also, regardless, however we measure density, when we talk about public health, it says nothing about how that density is managed, about how the pandemic is managed. Are there mask mandates? Do people practice distancing? Is there access to the outdoors? These things have little or sometimes nothing to do with density. Does density defined as building density mean intensity of street use? Some people think so, but it doesn't. Of course, there's plenty of examples of, a lot of high density neighborhoods that aren't very intense at all. What does density do to us? The first thinkers to identify links between the urban environment and behavior, Tunney's, Simmel, Wirth, they revered density. Wirth defined it simply as the number of people settled in a particular area, and famously concluded that it leads to utilitarianism and efficiency, and that it undermined personal relationships, which became superficial and transitory. Others, like Jane Jacobs, welcomed the kind of anonymity that density engendered, finding it kind of liberating. Does density make us happier? Does it make us healthier? Does it make us more civically engaged? There are a lot of articles and studies about this, few which frankly I've read, but a cursory scan of some of the literature suggests radically different conclusions, and to me suggests maybe that these are bad questions, right? That maybe the worst kind of environmental determinism, no matter how you define density, no aspect, I think, of the built environment can make you anything. There are just too many non-spatial factors at play. Is density more sustainable? Is it more equitable? Not necessarily. And so as a built environment professional, it kind of pains me to say it, but the built environment just doesn't explain everything or even most things. To return to the brief, there's this question: should we privilege density? The brief says that there's a bias towards density in the design planning discourse. As someone who spends a lot of time hanging out, palling around schools of design and planning, I can say that that is absolutely true, for sure. And so the brief also asks, is it time to rethink the ideal of density? Maybe, right? And I guess I'll put it this way. I think that we can stand to be a little bit more pluralist. People have very different preferences for how, where, with whom they want to live. Believe it or not, some people live very happy, peaceful, sustainable, civically engaged, and non-racist lives in low-density environments. And so I would just say, given how unconvincing some of the rational arguments are for density, I don't think we need to be bullies about it. Frankly, there is, I think, a class bias in our profession that kind of works against this kind of pluralism. I'm a fan of Denise Scott Brown, who coined a term called socioplastics. The sociologist Herbert Gans has written about this a lot. In fact, he wrote that planners, quote, should not monopolize wisdom about goals and values. Diversity is valuable, and people are entitled to live in any way they choose, unless that way can be proved to be destructive to them or their fellow men, which sometimes it certainly is, and we'll get to that. both are very, I think, sympathetic to a lot of things urbanists tend to hate: strip malls, suburbs, other low density environments. They're adherents of a kind of cultural pluralism. We have a lot to learn from them. We've got a lot to learn from, old books, oldies but goodies, like Learning from Las Vegas, right? The first sentence in that book is, I think, still true. Learning from the existing landscape is a way of being revolutionary for an architect, right? And there's this criticism in the book about, in design schools, the existing landscape is usually the problem, the before, and where after is taken to mean, after the problem's been fixed. So they write, quote, "An analysis of existing American urbanism is a socially desirable activity to the extent that it teaches us architects to be more understanding and less authoritarian in the plans we make." I would say that, the basic building blocks of suburbia, for example, low density suburbia, because we can't even say that suburbia isn't dense, because sometimes it is. But the basic building blocks, houses, office parks, shopping malls, etc., do not, as one notorious and curmudgeonly critic wrote, constitute a geography of nowhere, but a potentially rich backdrop for places that are as complex and meaningful as any urban environment. Adjectives like soulless, cookie cutter, boring, that commentators liberally affix to the suburban experience almost always oversimplify, and I think betray a tendency all too prevalent in the design professions to universalize our own values and tastes. Suburbs don't appeal to everyone, but there's a reason why more than half of Americans live in them, why they continue to account for a large majority of population growth in major urban areas, and why even most of the fastest growing cities are characterized by sprawling suburban style land use patterns. People like them. They see them as an attractive, affordable, and desirable option. They're not for white people anymore. Despite what Donald Trump thinks, I don't think Donald Trump has actually been to a suburb in maybe 40 years, but they've been obviously diversifying for decades. Lewis Mumford's enduring image, quote, of a multitude of uniform, unidentifiable houses lined up inflexibly at uniform distances on uniform roads in a treeless communal waste inhabited by people of the same class, the same income, the same group, conforming in every outward and inward respect to a common mold. That quotes, end quote. That still strikes a chord, but there's little question that suburbs are rapidly changing. I think everyone knows by now, no longer the exclusive province of well-off white car-driving nuclear families. They are increasingly diverse. In fact, I think this is really radically oversimplifying things, but I think a cynic might kind of point out that the so-called great inversion, the white affluent rediscovery of the city, coincided with people of color finally making gains, right, in suburbs. So yes, to go back to the brief, we should absolutely explore alternate modes of social life that different scales of density might afford. I think that's actually well put. This is something, by the way, that my practice tries to do. In the last 9 minutes and 40 seconds, I'm gonna maybe show you some examples of how we tried to do this. So for those who missed the introduction, that's the longest I've gone without actually sharing slides, by the way. That was an experiment for me. So this is my firm. We're called Interboro Partners, and we've been around for a while. And these are my partners, Georgine and Tobias. We do planning, architecture, and urban design. And just a quick overview. We design public spaces. Some in dense environments, some not. We do a lot of public sector planning. We're very interested in community engagement, and we design a lot of kind of curricular artifacts aimed at getting people to talk to us so that we get input in whatever we're working on. And we also do a lot of kind of educational kind of curricular pieces. That's us in a nutshell. Oh, we write. So there's a book that came out that touches on some of the topics that we're going to touch on today. All right, ancient history. Let's rewind the clock to 2002. This is the first project we ever did. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail. It was about a dead shopping mall. There's a competition in 2002. It said, go out, find a dead shopping mall, and tell us why it died, and come up with some compelling reuse for it. I think in this project, we discovered, as the brief says, a very interesting mode of social life. the thesis of the project was, yeah, this mall, the Duchess Mall in Fishkill, New York, yeah, this mall is dead, in that it was closed, right? But actually, since it closed, people started using the mall and the parking lot for all kinds of things. Something we learned really was just by hanging out, talking to people and observing. So, you know, just kind of spending time hanging out in this parking lot and trying to piece together clues about why so many people were using the kind of remains of this mall, even though it had officially closed its doors. So we just started to compile kind of some of the things that we had observed around the kind of carcass of this mall. And we just drew it. You know, we looked at 1974 when this mall was fully occupied. We, you know, this was the mall as a healthy patient with a good pulse. And this was it, you know, by the time we looked at it in 2002, just a couple of programs, a kind of faint pulse. But there was this kind of thing that happened on the weekends where people came and set up a flea market, and they actually got inside of the mall and used an old James Way for all kinds of stuff. And then there was this kind of heart, or this kind of arrhythmia, right, where you never knew what was going to, you know, you might go one day and there'd be a classic car show there, and or a UFO sighting group. You know, at a certain point, we got to talk to some of the people who were sort of making use of this very low density space. People like Jay, who kind of sold hot dogs out of the parking lot, and Peter, who ran one of the few businesses, which was a cleaners. But we learned that these people were actually thriving not because the mall died, but not in spite of the mall dying, but because of it. They were really benefiting from a lack of density. So Peter here was able to consolidate a lot of the different businesses that had happened in the mall. So he sold tickets, he sold food. It was, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but anyway, the project was really looking at these little clues and then just finding small little things to kind of exacerbate or incubate some of the stuff that we saw in this mall parking lot, whether that was, you know, a kind of sculpture space outside of the McDonald's drive-through, or a club in the back of the abandoned mall where we saw kids hanging out because there was no one else around. Another old project we did was another oldie but goodie, was to do a study of common interest developments. These are developments where residents kind of have the benefit of amenities that as individual households they might not otherwise be able to afford. So this is a kind of roadmap through some of America's common interest developments, radical common interest developments. So we looked at, for example, Sky Village. It's a community at the foot of some mountains in Arizona. And astronomer residents benefit from having astronomer neighbors who also want to look at the stars and who are therefore less likely to pollute the night sky with bright indoor lights, and they can make rules according to help them be better stargazers. And so we looked at a lot of different communities like that, very low density communities that were interesting and only possible because of the lack of density in some cases. You know, another early project was this project, which was another competition entry, which was a project about Detroit. And this was back in the mid 2000s. And it was a submission to a competition about shrinking cities. When we decided to put a project together for this, we just spent a lot of time in Detroit, kind of walking and driving around. And it struck us after spending some time there that people who stuck it out, you know, through race riots, deindustrialization, through disinvestment, people who stuck it out appeared to be spreading out, right? Kind of taking land next to their house. And we thought this was very compelling, especially because no one at the time had really paid attention to this phenomenon. So we coined a term for this. When a homeowner takes, borrows, or buys one or more adjacent lots, the connected lots form a blot. So on the left you have the before, and on the right you have the after. And so we were looking at basically a city that went from this to this. People are just remaking the DNA of the city. They're changing the genetic code and turning it into something way less dense, right? By having these kind of much larger lots. And there's a cumulative effect here that we call the new suburbanism, right? Future Detroiters are going to inherit what you see on the right, not what you see on the left. It's not dense, right? They're de-densifying the city. You could be critical of that, or you could actually see how it works for people, which we tried to do by kind of withholding our judgment and understanding how people were able to kind of rethink their entire house because they had land to kind of spread out into next to their house. Or two sisters who are able to buy 2 houses on one lot and build a shared garden in the middle. People really surprise you when you kind of pay close attention. These lots became very popular, and this is our guy named Mike who had his friend fly over his blot in a helicopter. You can see a picture of it here, and he had a picture of it on his living room table. You can see this gigantic fence, which was encompassing 7 contiguous lots. Anyway, so more recently, this is a project we just finished last year. After kind of inviting ourselves to Detroit many years ago, we had a chance to keep working in the city. Right now, our office is working on quite a few projects in Detroit, including this neighborhood master plan. And we're working in this neighborhood called Campout, Davison, Banglatown. It is a very diverse neighborhood, very interesting one, and a neighborhood with a lot of vacant land. It's a framework plan, lots of recommendations for open space, transit, and so on. But once again, we're dealing with blotting. And that's the part I kind of want to focus on here. So again, we're in a project where we're actually promoting, in a way, lower density. In the East Davison Village neighborhood, for example, which is part of our planning area, let's look at it. There's a lot of vacancy, as you see. Here are all the parcels in that area. We could single out the ones that are owned by the Detroit Land Bank. These in the darker green are ones that are privately owned. Of those, these are the ones that are blots, right? Accumulations of adjacent parcels. But then beyond that, there's what we would call stewardship. Neighbors don't merely buy land next to their houses. Sometimes they take care of them. They mow the lawn, they clean up trash, maybe because they have some interest in the land further down the line, or maybe they're just being good neighbors. So we could look at Lonnie and Mike. These are cousins, longtime residents who took over the corner store at Goddard and Deering here. While they don't own the 3 vacant lots that you see here, they keep them clear of trash and debris. They host regular pay what you want community barbecues. They have neighborhood message board. And because there's no neighborhood basketball courts, they maintain a temporary basketball court on the street. We'd also point to Mr. Moden, a Bangladeshi immigrant farmer who runs a profitable farm operation on a cluster of 9 parcels. This offers another example. A very interesting story that I won't recount about how Mr. Moden got where he is. But but you can see he has a lot of lots that he uses to farm, makes a good income doing it. This is another example. This is the New Hope. It's an Islamic community center in the neighborhood, and it's in a reused commercial space. What's interesting is to see the way this center over time bought adjacent vacant land and buildings and added to its program of community activities, right, based on spaces that became available. So there's a big piece of vacant land. They turned it into a soccer field because their constituents wanted to see that. A lot of abandoned gardens turned into a community garden. There's a large parking lot that got turned into a vegetable market. So we see, a very important node for the large Bangladeshi community here, a kind of new civic institution that emerged in a way out of the combination of a broadly framed mission to do something good on the one hand, but also just the pragmatics of blotting, of just piecing together land. So I won't take you through our kind of proposals for this project because I'm out of time. But I do want to say that we took at the end, one of our recommendations was to pre-package some of these lots as blots, right? And to also give land to these stewards, right? That's in a way de-densifying the neighborhood. It's changing that DNA, to go back to that drawing that we saw. But in our mind, that was a more kind of bottom-up approach and one more appropriate than an approach that insists on densifying certain pockets of the neighborhood. It's based on a kind of practice that we saw, that we thought was compelling and that seemed to work for people. And so we just kind of rolled with it. Maybe I'll stop there because I'm already at 21 minutes. There's plenty else to talk about, but I can't wait to hear from Jay. So let me stop there.
Jay, take it away.
It was wonderful to hear from you, and thank you for opening this conversation. I will begin where I always begin, and that is with an actual human being. Slide, please. Since coronavirus, Katrina, a former foster care kid, visits her elderly birth mother twice per week to provide in-home support and ensure that she is social distancing. These visitations are a part of a decade-long journey toward reconciling their fractured relationship and a rhythmic dance that began long before the pandemic. These days, Katrina's walk from her basement apartment on a residential street 2 short blocks from her mother's public housing apartment is filled with a new complication. When Katrina approaches her mother's building, she is greeted by bare-faced construction workers huddled together. A violent stairwell mugging prompted the housing provider to install a security system and replace a malfunctioning video camera. So she now uses a key fob to enter the foyer. Too small for social distancing, the foyer is little more than a row of mailboxes on the left and a couple of benches now abandoned on the right. 2 of the 3 elevators are chronically out of service, and the sole operating lift is often sullied with urine and feces. She takes it all the way to the top of the building where harsh fluorescent lights expose chipped walls and aging brown laminate floors. Katrina slowly steps out, looks over her shoulder, then hurries down the hallway and enters the apartment. Her ama, a South Asian word for mother, greets her with an unhealed silence entangled in histories of war and displacement. The pair navigate the tiny apartment wordlessly beneath a ceiling speckled with a yellowish popcorn pattern. Sometimes Katrina stares out a window that lets in rain and cold at a condo across the street. She notices an array of sleek blinds instead of garbage bags and old bed sheets, shielding the dignity of its residents. Exhaling deeply, she wonders if the air is as heavy on the other side. So it is this distance, not the street separating these 2 particular buildings, but a profound socio-spatial divide where coronavirus health and density disparities are laid bare. And while there is a risk that highlighting this reality could fuel what award-winning writer Doug Saunders describes as an atavistic, deep-set fear of big cities as pits of disease, negating this divide poses an even greater threat to the advancement of urban intensification. Instead of merely postulating about the desirability of density, it is necessary to define good urban density. Slide, please. So one of the things that I think is so critically important to talk about is the fact that residential density is not equitably designed, funded, or maintained. Slide, please. So before I go into this particular slide, I just want to read just a little bit of a section from a paper focused on mid-density written by Sarah Ansell and Michelle Thompson Fawcett. The pair write, the compact city concept is one that is widely endorsed by practitioners in terms of its contribution to the development of a more sustainable urban form. While the environmental benefits of intensifying land uses have been keenly debated over the last decade, much less attention has been paid to the question of whether the compact city promotes social sustainability. And I think that it is this question of social sustainability that I'm very intrigued by. And that is where we see massive fault lines in this density scheme. And so in the, I read a section of my Azure article to you, and that was a true story of a young woman who allowed me to share her story. During COVID, a number of people were posting about terrible circumstances they were experiencing in dense, low-income, racialized neighborhoods, specifically in the suburbs, while mainstream status quo urbanists were yelling over their voices, championing density, making very blanket statements about density being fantastic. I'm not wearing sequins this evening by accident. I'm actually celebrating the opportunity to delve deeply into this subject matter, to really unpack and interrogate the kinds of impositional colonial city arguments being perpetuated by many of my colleagues. I tweeted recently that it is almost impossible to even question density within urbanism because there's been a decision that it is good. And when you question density, many mainstream status quo white urbanists respond like a cross between a flat earther and someone who absolutely doesn't believe in any form of evidence whatsoever. And so this evening, I thought I would bring some receipts. For those of you who don't know what receipts are, I'm a Scarborough girl. What that means is tonight I'm going to bring some facts. So here we go. There is downtown density, which most mainstream status quo urbanists refer to when they talk about density. And then there are forgotten and neglected densities. And so I came up with the term forgotten and neglected density, largely informed by my friend and mentor, Roger Kyle, who is a foremost thinker on suburban life. He's also a professor, and he talks about the peripheries, meaning the suburbs and the pluralism brought up by Daniel, which exists in the urban landscape. And he points out many of the points that Daniel has so astutely pointed out this evening. The urban landscape is more and more a suburban reality. Yet, we tend to castigate the suburbs. And again, I'm a Scarborough girl, so I love the suburbs. So I'm not, although I live downtown, I'm just going to name my bias right now. So I'm going to dive right in. So let's do a little bit of a comparison between downtown density and forgotten and neglected density. So downtown density, let's dive right in. Downtown density tends to have amazing access to amenities. There are libraries and swimming pools and childcare centers. When we go outside of the downtown core, there's a lack of access to amenities. Things like libraries, swimming pools, and childcare centers tend to be quite rare in some neighborhoods. In fact, in the community where I grew up, there was only the sort of like archetypal, stereotypical basketball court below ground, but there wasn't a library or a swimming pool. So the amenities surrounding the residential density is very important, and we rarely talk about that. Life does not happen in a box. Life happens in a neighborhood. So I find it really interesting that my colleagues talk about complete streets and complete neighborhoods, but then when they start talking about density, they don't have that sort of analysis, like looking around, like what is around the area, and are the amenities around the area actually supporting dignified and a dignified life and joy and just allowing people to thrive. When I look at downtown density, and again, downtown density is primarily condo density. It's condo density, it is overpriced, it is contributing to the financialization of the entire housing sector, and it is actually driving us further down the rabbit hole of a very dangerous housing crisis that's been occurring for over a decade. So if we look at condo density, oftentimes there's an ensuite laundry and full kitchen appliances. People who live in forgotten densities, up to 300 to 500 people share a laundry room, and they're often partial kitchens. There are also single occupancy rooms where people don't even really have a kitchen at all. Downtown density, there's a concierge often and a spacious reception area. Forgotten density, we get a security guard room and no reception area. Downtown, well-maintained, functioning elevators, regular cleaning, ground maintenance, forgotten, poorly maintained. Downtown, great interior amenities, swimming pools, media rooms, rock climbing walls, gyms. When we go outside of the city, lack of interior amenities. Now, this is a term that I've used to explain also interior density. So we often talk about amenities in terms of the, the services that we have outside of where residential density occurs. But what about inside, like the design inside these buildings? We need to look at that as well. Downtown, there's a sense of safety without police presence. Imagine that. Outside of the city, somehow we can't have safety without having over-policing. Downtown, we're close to public transportation and other active mobility options. Downtown, options decrease significantly. I mean, out of the suburbs, out in the suburbs rather. Downtown, we're able to leverage private and public dollars for new development initiatives due to its location and the desirability of the downtown, but we can't do the same in the suburbs because developers are actually leading the design of our cities. I just want to say that one more time. Developers who are not trained in placemaking at all, who have no interest really in public good. Housing is a human right. They now are leading the development of our housing and our communities. Really dangerous situation. Downtown density. We have high functioning and high and energy efficient HVAC systems, and outside of the downtown, primarily, there's aging substandard HVAC systems, and essentially the buildings are sick buildings. Slide, please. So here's what downtown urbanists generally mean when they reference density and they say it's fantastic. Let's go to the other slide, please. Here are other forms of density that are inconvenient. People don't want to talk about these forms of density. There are prisons, there are crowded shelters, there are elderly cage housing. I don't know if people have heard that term before. In Asia, there's actually something called elderly cage housing or coffin housing. And that is literally where seniors live in cages and they only accommodate a bed. Slide, please. We also have, prisons, and we don't talk about that as residential density. We definitely warehouse people in prisons as though prison was actually, a home, that it's an adequate sort of holding place for people. And so people live in prisons. We don't talk about the conditions of prisons, and that's very important. And that photo in the middle, that is the photo of the cage housing. So elderly people live in those little tiny cages. Slide, please. And so coronavirus has laid bare density inequities in neighborhoods right across North American cities, including right here in Toronto. And, recently I had the opportunity to collaborate with a small group of architects along with 11 amazing women who I've known for a number of years. And we together, primarily with the architects on the front end, we did some assessments of some of those forgotten density types. And one of the things that we found right away was that the issues were so overwhelming that we could never address all of them within the scope of work. And so in collaborating and thinking things through with the architects, we really focused our efforts on a daycare. The daycare happens to be in the building where I grew up. So in the public housing building where I grew up. And when we did that assessment, firstly, it was really important to me to move to sort of like a community hub setting, because I thought that that's where we would get the most impact for the most people, because it became, again, very clear that we couldn't really address individual units, which is how, as Daniel pointed out, density is generally measured. So we found a daycare with lovely women, and the conditions that they were working in it was just so deplorable. I was so fortunate, again, to work with these architects, to really spend the time to listen to these women, to center them, to not just think about spatial metrics like square footage or how many units we can get on an acre, but to think about human metrics in terms of the ways in which the space was working for them in terms of their health and their dignity and connectivity, and also beauty, which I think is, not a word. I was told about 7 years ago that that was not a word that architects used. Now I notice architects following my lead and using words like dignified design and beauty a lot more frequently, and that's great to see. So anyways, we all really paid a lot of close attention to these human metrics. And so right away, one of the architects discovered that the HVAC unit was actually intended for a small living room with 4 people, not a service provision space with a number of children. There for the entire day. So no wonder the air quality was terrible in that kind of density. And along with another architect, I, interviewed the manager of the daycare. And one of the things that she immediately noted was that on really hot days, children actually thought more, they were lethargic, and sometimes they couldn't get up from their naps. That really struck me as super serious, because in all of the research that I've done, those kinds of symptoms are tethered to sick buildings, poor air and heat quality, and buildings that are desperately in need of a retrofit. And so we were able to go in and resolve some seemingly small issues, but with tremendous impact. One of the spaces that we focused on in the daycare was this closet that was doubling as a storage room for a mountain of toys, along with a janitorial room. And this was also the break room where these women had to, eat their lunch. It was so incredibly atrocious, like the situation that existed there. And I just thought, for all of those downtown elite urbanists, championing density, they would have lasted in that space for maybe 2 minutes. Slide, please. So, social equity is often ascribed to the compact city with little or no verification. This is a quote from the paper that I referenced earlier. So, back to what Daniel said, like this whole idea, does density make you happier? Does it make you a better citizen? Does it create social cohesion? We don't actually know. And so we should stop saying that, because we don't know that to be true, because urbanists are not curious enough to ask the right questions and then go and get the answers. And I shouldn't say all urbanists, I'll just say many urbanists, because I count myself. Obviously, I'm an urbanist as well. So I'll just be really careful with my framing of that. Slide, please. So what constitutes density inequity? I promise I'm not going to read all of these points, because I think I'm getting really close to my time. But I really, using a holistic lens, again, human metrics policy, and not just spatial metrics, but including spatial metrics, here's some things that constitute density inequity. Negating that popular density forms are culturally specific and have been imposed on racialized low-income residents, much like colonization. Mainstream urbanists are attempting to colonize the suburbs. Let's call it what it is. It is happening in the colonial city. And during a moment where we are interrogating the history of land use, looking at the harms that land use has caused, it is just unthinkable that we would continue down this path. And let me just say this as well. Density is not a new urban idea. Many of the people and the places that mainstream urbanists castigate actually come from communities and cultures where density was natural. We come from families where there's multi-generational housing. We come from, communities, even rural communities, where you have a single yard, but many little huts or homes within that yard. So we're experts at gentle and mid-scale density. density. We don't need to have those ideas imposed on us. We actually know what that is because we come from cultures where we did density without having to use fancy language and also without feeling the need to propagate it everywhere. So local context really matters as well. And let me just say this as well. We actually imported, ideas like tower in the park. We brought it over to North America. This universalizing of like these approaches to design have been nothing but destructive. So I don't know why we continue down that path. Also, saving low-income residents living in slums without consultation or appreciation for informal placemaking sites and rituals. So this idea that density was born because these urbanists needed to swoop in and save these poor people from themselves. Now, certainly when there was slum clearance, definitely contributed to public health, and it was urgent and needed. However, to negate the fact that those people had schools, places of worship, social connectivity, they had internal courtyards, like negating all of that, and then flattening all of that and starting again, so violent and colonial. Also, listen to this, here we go. We're castigating people from the suburbs. And I find that really hypocritical because actually status quo mainstream urbanists are the ones that actually created sprawl and also the desire for the single family home and the car. Right? So they sold a lot of those racialized poor people the dream and brainwashed people into thinking that it was shameful to live in a multifamily home, or it was shameful to maybe be a renter and not have the status of a homeowner. And now 30 years later, they're like, oh, now that we've actually made a ton of equity off single home ownership, we think that you shouldn't do that anymore. That's not a good idea. That's not for you. We have to save the planet. That is so hypocritical and really needs to be interrogated. I already talked about over-policing within a lot of these communities, also enforcing prohibitive policies and rules restricting the agency of residents living in dense, low-income neighborhoods. And the last thing that I'll say from this list is that as we're moving forward with this scheme around density, we actually are not challenging protected neighborhoods, which is essentially contemporary modern day class and race-based segregation. Shame on us. Slide, please. And so this is where I grew up. This is my community. And so, I talked about the laundry room. Look at this laundry room. Could people socially distance in this laundry room? 500 people in this high rise. This is the foyer, certainly not a sexy concierge desk. And the elevator is about this thin. So think about COVID. When urbanists say that density in terms of numbers of people and also per square footage or acreage has no impact on a pandemic that is airborne, that requires social distancing in these tiny little spaces, that is just completely a denial of the reality that we're living in when we look at different types of density. Slide, please. So I don't deny that dense urban landscapes are the primary pathway to a sustainable urban future, but I'm interrogating how we get there. So we're not going to get there by shaming people who we've actually forced into sprawl and car dependency. We're not going to get there that way. We're also not going to get there through a colonial city approach and imposing a particular class, race, and cultural sort of view on people. And we're not going to get there by doing density one way. I think there are some really great conversations emerging around sort of mid-scale density. In Toronto, we talk about the missing middle. Gil Meslin actually coined the term, and a friend of mine, Sean Galbraith, has really added to that term. I think there's great possibility there, but I will tell you that if it doesn't have affordability, if it doesn't have flexibility, if it doesn't actually have a life cycle for people to live in different ways, then it's not good. Slide, please. So what is good urban density? So here's the thing. I normally end presentations by sort of throwing out 5 big ideas, but for a question that is this complex and this large, I think that urbanists really need to take a step back, take a deep breath, and not assume that any one of us could ever answer this question. Sometimes I think that the best way to demonstrate intellect is by asking good questions. So I'm going to end as a really smart and humble urbanist asking this question and not answering it, because I think that that requires all of us. Thanks.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you, Dan. Those are both great talks. Quite different. You know, I appreciate the kind of different perspectives that you both bring to the table, one coming from a kind of design practice, one coming from a kind of design perspective, but also engaging in practices of activism. And so there's some distinctions, of course, between the way you present and the things that you're talking about. But there's something that I found really interesting. I had another question that I was going to lead with, but I decided to change it because there's something that was quite interesting about what both of you did, which was, you know, kind of beginning or at least threading through your presentation stories about people doing things. And there's this idea of kind of social sustainability, I think that Jay mentioned. Maybe it draws from that idea of understanding how people live in a space. And in paralleling with that, there's, I would say probably something else consistent or that I found common between the two of you is maybe a resistance to kind of totalizing narratives of urbanism. So whether they be modernists or more contemporary planners who assert that density is a solution to everything. So there's something about those two elements that I find interesting and also a little confusing, and I'll cut to the chase. So there's, both of you are quite interested in what's going on the ground, you know, either embracing some guy in a parking lot selling tickets and doing laundry, or, you know, realizing that there's value in the lived experience of a crowded condo tower. But at the same time, you know, there's also something else that you're saying. There's critiques of what's happening. There's the problem of that condo tower being sick, as Jay mentioned. And while Dan maybe never says anything about there being an issue with depopulation, we maybe can assume that in certain cases in Detroit, that maybe that's not always the best thing or so rosy. And so what I'd maybe like to start with, and maybe you can start with Jay, is this idea of observing a place, on one hand, appreciating its qualities, while at the same time critiquing its issues or problems. How do you negotiate those two parallel tendencies when you decide to take action, or is that even possible?
I think it is possible. So first off, you know, in design thinking, there's this paradigm of the problem and the solution. People do not want the places where they live to be characterized as a problem. It's deeply disrespectful. So I don't see places as problems because I understand the way that that psychologically and emotionally resonates with the community, especially low income, racialized communities. And so I think that it's always better to begin by asking people what they love about their community, even communities that have tremendous growth opportunities like gaps in design or policy or walkability. There's always something great that can be found in those communities. And I just think that that is the most respectful way to start the conversation. So I always begin by using an asset-based lens. That's number one. Number two, I also really avoid this idea of observation. So you don't want to, again, make people subjects that you're coming in and observing. What you want to do is walk alongside people. You want them to vet you. You want them to earn their trust, not gain buy-in, but earn their trust. And also meet them where they are and just begin to authentically and naturally learn about how they're experiencing their space.
Yeah, well, let me start by saying, Jay, I really enjoyed that talk a lot. And I think Michael is right. There really were a lot of similarities, I think, in the talk. And I think Michael identified them, story about people doing things, both kind of resisting totalizing narratives. Mostly I just found myself nodding along to basically whatever you said. And I like your answer to this question. I too try to take an asset-based approach to things. You had an interesting line, good places out of bad situations. I think that is maybe describes the situation that we observed in Detroit. Doing the kind of work that we do at Interboro, it kind of messes with you in some ways, because you can see in this talk, I get genuinely excited about some of the things that we see and the people that we meet, the people who are doing this property accumulation in Detroit, Mr. Moten, and you know, and it's incredible, and or as you said, you know, the guy at the dead mall selling bus tickets in the dead mall parking lot. I mean, there's something that is kind of wonderful about seeing the way in which people sometimes, you know, make lemonade with lemons that they're dealt, right? And so much of the joy for me of what I do is just being able to walk alongside someone and understand how they see a place and how they experience it, and to be surprised by what you find. So my talk today was really about, I think, the kind of enthusiasm, and it was probably seemed very positive. I could have given another talk, you know, maybe that focused on the book that we wrote, The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion, which would have had a very different tone. It wouldn't have been about Mr. Moten and these kind of you know, inspiring ways that people are kind of making it in these neighborhoods. It would have been a story about structural inequality, about racism, about how the cards are, the deck is stacked, you know, in a lot of ways, about how, as you know, you alluded to, Michael, Detroit should not have been, obviously, it should not have experienced what it did, right? And so you have to kind of hold these two ideas in your head at the same time, to be extremely critical of the process, right? Jay, you said something that was, I think, right on about you're interrogating how we're getting to density, right? It's important to be critical of the process. It's important to be critical of the process of suburbanization. It was horrible. It was racist. I mean, it was all the terrible things you could say about it, right? And yet it happened. And yet people today live in suburbs, and yet people today deal with the legacy, right? So you have to be able to not, you know, pathologize it. You have to be able to see, again, both these ideas at the same time, that the process is terrible, but the product in some ways is what people make it. And that, so that's how I would answer your question. A little bit long-winded, but there you have it.
Maybe as a brief follow-up, and then I know Fadi's got a parallel question to ask you all. I still, you know, this is something that I don't want to kind of press it, but I want to maybe throw a little fuel on the fire, so to speak, because so okay, let's say you got something you're dealing with, a project you're working on, and there's things you go to a place, you experience the inhabitants, and you learn from what's going on, and you seek to kind of draw out the good of what people are doing, drawing on their own resilience in an environment, their own efforts to deal with the issues they confront. How does that relate to? I mean, so. And this maybe, I hope this isn't too redundant, but, you know, so in the suburbs, for example, residents that live near this mall, perhaps they don't have two cars because they can't afford them anymore. And so there's this problem of transit inequity that we have in cities today. And, you know, so in your mind, as you approach a problem such as someone's, the kind of beauty that they display when they construct a new experience and assert their agency in the world, how do how do folks negotiate that with, or how designers negotiate that when they're confronting kind of real issues or real problems? So I don't know, like.
Yeah, and let me just say, it's not just that you need to hold these two readings. You have to work at both ends. So you have to, obviously, as planners, as people who care about equity, we need to be doing things that are maybe a little bit more top down, right? Like we need, obviously, we should all be pushing for fair housing. We should all be doing a lot of things that have nothing to do with what anybody on the ground's behavior is, right? I mean, we need to, at the same time, be working on larger structural change. There's absolutely no question about it.
If it's okay, I can also pick up on this conversation a little bit and add to it, because I think, it's very difficult to have a conversation about urban density today and not bring up the question of carbon and the climate crisis. And in a very important way, the climate crisis also exemplifies both the intersection of social justice and environmental justice, which is becoming really critical and very apparent within the urban fabric itself. And when I say the urban fabric, I'm also referring to the larger metropolitan region as a whole. Jay, you kind of hit on this just a little bit when we started talking about tower neighborhoods. And for those of you that don't know, Toronto has the largest stock of modernist 1960s, 70s tower buildings in North America. And obviously these towers are reaching a kind of end expiry date structurally. And they've been the subject of many kind of projects and studies and initiatives over the past few years. But most critically, just last year, the Toronto's first resilience strategy identified tower renewal, they call it that, as the priority action for the future resilience of Toronto, precisely because it's at the intersection of environmental and social issues. And obviously the kind of housing and affordability metrics that are very much needed for the city to continue to kind of survive and not, fall apart. So I'm actually, this is a project that I'm currently working on through the School of Cities, which is a very interdisciplinary and large project, which is looking at the park portion of the tower in the parks. So not just the towers themselves, but the fabric that holds them together, the public and private open spaces. These are open spaces that are often fenced off. They're underutilized or underused. They are often inaccessible to the residents in many cases. And they've been deemed for most of, at least my education as a really problematic part of the urban fabric. They're anti-urban, they're dead space, and the kind of default is always, the default instinct is to densify them. We need to fill those areas with buildings and add more building stock in between these towers as a kind of de facto solution, both for the climate crisis, but also because to solve the issue of dead space. And as you know, like these areas over time, they've got mature canopies, they've got big trees that sequester carbon. The trees were planted at around the same time those buildings were built. And they perform a whole lot of environmental, they sequester carbon, they allow for water infiltration. So they've got a whole lot of positive climatic issues, yet they remain, on top of all of that, offer mental health benefits to the population around them. So, to long wind my questions to you guys is, the anti-density, the kind of the value of the public open space that is not often attributed to the automatic densification and addition of more buildings and building stock to qualify these areas as environmental and kind of value beyond, their development value, and understand them as a kind of structure for the overall resilience of the city. So I'm wondering what your views on that, and Jay, maybe specifically because you know those areas really well, and what you might have thoughts about that from that point of view.
Yeah, so if we're looking at environmentalism, so that the sustainability argument, so first and foremost, because I know that when you challenge density, status quo urbanists challenge you using the sustainability argument. So no one cares more about sustainability than low-income racialized people, because low-income racialized people are most impacted. So let's just start there, both in terms of a global context and also in a regional urban context, number one. Number two, with the way that we're developing density and moving forward with density, by actually neglecting those buildings that are in desperate, it's not that they have reached their expiration date, they have been intentionally neglected, and policies and funding mechanisms are focused on building more buildings rather than taking care of the existing buildings. And so from an environmental standpoint, by not retrofitting those buildings, that's actually huge environmental problematic impact. So that's one. Number two, those spaces that you're talking about, the main problem with those spaces is not that they don't have high towers on them. So that's also counterintuitive to get rid of green space to build more towers. The problem is that it's the building siting. So the building sort of like faces, oftentimes in these communities, the buildings have their back to the street or any kind of arteries that connects those communities to the larger city and to the larger neighborhoods, right? And so the problem with those areas is that the building siting is all wrong, because we have, again, what I mentioned, the tower and the park design. So the building siting is all wrong. And those green spaces, it isn't that there's too much of them or we should get rid of them, because we absolutely shouldn't if we're actually using an environmental argument. What we should do, though, is to define them just a little bit more so that they are actually more functional, more safe, and usable.
Yeah, I mean, all of that, I agree. I agree. I guess I would say, you know, on the, I can't resist. I mean, on the tower and the park question, you know, I think a lot of the arguments around how they're dull and they're not dense and they don't sort of engender the kind of urbanity that we all like. I don't totally buy that, right? Jane Jacobs obviously hated them and said that they were sealed against any buoyancy or vitality of city life. But if you look at the way they function in New York City, you realize that actually it has a lot to do with who lives in them and also where they are. So there are some towers in the park that are like way out in the outer boroughs, and they do feel somewhat like islands. But then there are ones that are right in the middle of Chelsea in Manhattan, and actually they work extremely well and are very porous and have a very good relationship to the kind of more traditional mixed use density around them. I'll also say that they also, parks in towers in the park, at least in New York, which I'm depending again on where they are and who lives in them. For example, right now, for reasons that are more complex than we can go into, a disproportionate amount of towers in the park are inhabited by senior citizens. Who value and use, I think, not only the buildings but the green space in kind of different ways. You know, and I think that same kind of like situational answer, I think maybe I would apply to the question about like whether the park part of the towers in the park should be developed. I mean, the truth is, like, I completely agree with Jay that the priority should be on maintaining the structures that exist. And I mean, NYCHA is probably, you know, maybe the best public housing authority in the States, and still they are just billions of dollars behind on just basic repairs. It's really a tragedy. Tragedy, I would say, is really of a federal making. And I think one of the things I hope we get, if we get a more progressive government, is a kind of commitment to public housing. And that needs to start with kind of just replenishing the budgets for public housing authorities so that they could just fix these buildings. There's nothing wrong with them, essentially. And they house like a really big number of people in New York City. So fix them. But that said, you know, there are actually, I think, obviously we're in a big housing crisis in New York, as we are in most places. it's not the only answer, but an important way to get ourselves out of this is to build a lot more housing. And if you look at where you can build housing in New York, yes, we've got to upzone wealthy neighborhoods. Yes, let's upzone Soho and Park Slope. Let's make everybody, pay their fair share and shoulder the burden of increasing housing. But I think eventually we're going to have to look at maybe thinking about developing some of those sites. So I think it depends is a kind of cop-out answer, but that's where I'm going to land on that one.
Mm-hmm. I think a couple of things. Like I definitely think that again, it's about different density levels and types. I think that's the problem as well, right? So if we were sort of being creative and following sort of the neighborhood. I almost said character by accident because I don't want to use that NIMBY term, but if we followed the landscape, and then actually intensified those spaces with the landscape as our guide, I think that we'd be in a much better situation. And Daniel, I so agree with so much of what you've said. I just want to take a little bit of issue with this idea of like housing being a burden. I think we actually really have to like change the frame for that, right? Like, housing is a human right. Every community, every decent human being should embrace new residents and some degree of intensification. And so when we call it a burden, it actually can inadvertently, and I know this is not your intent at all, but it can inadvertently sort of like over-empower NIMBYs, because that's what they come out and say. We don't want this burden in our community. And we've invested in the character and all of that stuff. So it's not a burden, it's about more housing as we're experiencing the greatest immigration and migration to urban spaces in the history of humankind. Embracing intensification is a civic responsibility. And actually, citizens should not actually even have a say. I don't think that, it's kind of like segregation. I don't think that citizens should have a say. In the 60s, they should not have had a say as to whether or not someone like me got to live in their neighborhood, because their opinion, their comfort, their sense of burden is contravening my human rights. And I feel that today in 2020, that's what we're seeing. People's resistance to intensification is actually contravening human rights. And so I just don't want to call it a burden.
Couldn't agree more. Bad framing on my part, and totally agree with you. There's local control sounds good, and sometimes it is, of course, but sometimes it's not. The whole history of how we got to the mess we're in, I think, an important part of that story is, local control and people being able to have control of their zoning and using that zoning to say, nah, no, I don't want these kinds of people and these kinds of buildings, which of course were proxies for certain kinds of people. And here we are. And then here we are again today. I taught a studio about affordable housing in Los Angeles. I mean, there are people who think of it as a burden. They don't want to change what they perceive as their lifestyle or their neighborhood character. And I agree with you, tough luck.
And I mean, I also would like to just maybe implicate.
One of the things that I always say to people who are homeowners, you own your home, you don't own the neighborhood.
Right on.
So let's, Fadi, do maybe a comment, and then maybe we should get some questions.
Yeah, I also wanted to just kind of implicate the kind of political structures that enables NIMBYism. So at least in Toronto, you can essentially, vote out your city councillor and elect and change both planning policy and transportation policy to suit your political point of views versus good and just city building. So that's a whole other spectrum of conversation that I think would warrant a whole other afternoon. But it's really important to remember that all these conversations we're having here are highly tied to political structures and laws and judicial systems that we've enshrined and have shaped or rethought or reshaped for decades. So that's another afternoon. So let's open it up for some of the audience questions. Go ahead, Michael.
I'm actually itching to keep on talking, but I want to make sure we get some questions from our from our audience.
We'll hang out later, Michael.
Yeah, we'll do it.
In our virtual afternoon drinks.
We're gonna go out for drinks after this.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we have a question from Lisa. Okay, so here's the question quotes. Publicly led projects are starting to understand the necessity of this walk alongside engagement early. So I guess the idea that, you know, public projects are starting to bring engagement, community engagement into the process maybe earlier now than it had previously. Our current development structures really mitigate against this kind of engagement with the community, and community consultation is the thing that you do after the project is already designed. Any thoughts on how to wheedle into that structure?
You know, do you want to go, Daniel?
Yeah, after you.
I would just very quickly say that, you know, something that I'm really seeing, and I think that within the next decade, the structure will change because communities aren't having it anymore. So, you know, Daniel and I both work in Detroit, and something I'll tell you about Detroiters is they're not having it. They take no stuff. They know sometimes more about planning and land use than planners themselves and land use professionals. Citizens are becoming so aware. They're developing such a strong sense of spatial entitlement that they will just obstruct the development. Like, people are even making their own. I live in a community that is gentrifying its Chinatown because I'm adjacent to the Chinatown. And, you know, there are a group of activists here who made their own development sign and actually had it translated into an Asian language, you know? So this is what citizens are doing on the ground. They're like, guess what? I'm a planner too, bitches. Like, they're really getting involved. And so I don't think that we have to solve this problem. I think that communities are really solving the problem.
Yeah, gee, I don't really know what I have to add to that except to underline this point. Communities are not having it anymore. I think those of us who, you know, do planning see it all the time. I will say that it's true that I would say, you know, my office, we get most of our work, you know, going after requests for proposals, and, you know, we go after kind of public work in that way. And so I've seen over the last, you know, 10 years that we've been doing this, I've really seen a shift. The engagement is always front and center. There's always a lot of rhetoric, earnest rhetoric, I would say, put out by, I think, for the most part, depending on the project, earnest people who actually do care about, you know, not displacing people or getting people's opinions, or you know, having an open-ended process. I think most people in planning today, you know, are aware of the Arnstein ladder of citizen participation, and good reading you should check out if you haven't read that. Where, you know, coercion is really low, and you know, consultation is somewhere in the middle, and like community control is at the top. Anyway, the problem is that something's broken. Like something's really broken right now, and you know, for all like the good intentions and the good ideas, there's a real problem, you know, around being able to live together in a city. It's just people do actually, you know, there's a lot. Obviously, the literature around displacement and gentrification, like the literature around density, is extremely complicated, and it's extremely difficult to sort of really make heads or tails of it. But clearly, like, people do get displaced from neighborhood improvements. Like, clearly, people do see their neighborhoods change in ways that they don't want. It's true that affordable housing is not always affordable for people who actually live in the neighborhood that affordable housing gets built in. Like, something is like seriously broke. So it's not the planners. It's not really the planners' fault. The people who are writing these RFPs and directing these processes, I really think have good intentions, and I do think you can do really great things in the context of a neighborhood plan or a comp plan. But then there are some things that are just too big to address at that scale. You know, I think we really do need to up our commitment to, for example, public housing. I'll say it again, here in the States, cities can't build their way out of this, and they can't finance it. Like, we really need to think about larger solutions to this really big, wicked problem.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed. Let me grab another question. So let's see, where is it? It's a question about sprawl, and I guess versus infill. So, what do you think of sprawl? And so here we are talking about suburbs and appreciating maybe the lived experience happening within them. And so, should we continue to create them? Should we not create any more low density development? I mean, these are kind of should questions, or maybe tricky to answer, but it's maybe worth having an opinion about this. We can't just love something and then not promote its future, I think so.
Also, to qualify that suburban fabric is different in different places, and it's not a monolith either, right? So you've got the huge subdivision projects built by a single developer with cookie cutter homes, and then you've got a much more complex and diverse building stock in the suburban fabric that is fundamentally different from that too. So I think it's important to qualify the difference of those before we kind of give a single answer to that.
I don't really talk about sprawl, to be honest. I think so, because I think that it's really triggering for communities because it's so culturally coded and it's so class coded at this point. So is density. Like these words are so incredibly coded and they have meanings that really harm people, And so I don't really talk about sprawl, but the way that I would approach it is that I think it's good for everyone and the planet when we are better, knitted together and can access the things that we need in a relatively short period of time. So, urbanists are talking about the 15-minute city. And yesterday I was on a panel with someone who's talking about the 45 minutes sort of, neighborhood type thing or region, maybe not a neighborhood. I think the 45-minute idea is really great within a suburban context. 15 minutes is really ambitious. Like obviously we're talking about the downtown, right? So even these kinds of ideas, and just going back to something that Daniel said, that I think that we have to be really again, I keep using the term humility as I'm wearing a really shiny dress, but something that I do think that we have to be super humble about and aware of is that we have never lived together in the history of human beings. Our histories are all class systems, monarchies, caste systems, and clans. And so we're amid a grand experiment right now, having people across different classes and races, truly coexist together. So even in some of the most diverse cities across North America, people don't live together. Right? It's deceiving even when you count the diversity numbers. And so I think, when Daniel said that, I just thought that was something that I wanted to underscore, that because this is a grand experiment, it behooves us to take our time. So the climate clock is ticking and I get it. We have a housing crisis, so we absolutely need to build some housing. Absolutely. So we need to go fast and slow concurrently. And we also need to ensure that we're not scaling everything up or using a universal approach in this moment that, we're going to regret in 2 generations. We don't know. We're trying a thing.
Yeah, I think there's a really great question here from our previous Dean, Richard Sommer, which also picks up on this last comment that you just mentioned. And it says, with regard to urban form and the environmental performance of different kinds of urban and suburban fabrics, would it be fair to say that there is a strong equation between communities' wealth and affluence and their carbon footprint, or the amount of resources they consume? How might one change that equation?
Well, first of all, hi, Richard. I said Richard was, I just want to say, was one of my first professors back at the GSD in the early 2000s, and was, I think, very instrumental for better or for worse. I'm in part a product of his teaching and his example. So thank you for that, Richard. And I think Georgina and Tobias, my colleagues, would say the same. They also studied with Richard. So I really have a hard time making those kinds of links. And I think it comes back to the fact that what I said kind of at the beginning, that I just, there are so many non-spatial factors when you measure anything. And I'm really, really allergic to any kind of environmental determinism, even though my whole world is dealing with the environment, the built environment. And I mean, I could probably get in trouble for saying this, and a lot of people would really disagree, but like, you know, people who live in cities, I mean, statistically fly more. Okay, so why? If we're going to talk about, people live in dense cities, if you measure the carbon footprint of people, you have to kind of factor things like that. This gets all freakonomicsy, right? Like, what is the link? Like, is there an influence between density and you know, travel behavior? I don't know. I can't even begin to untangle that. But I guess I'm just automatically dubious of making any such links. It's super complicated, and there are all kinds of factors that I think explain these things. Some are spatial and some aren't. I hope that's not a cop out, Richard. You can let me know if it is.
Daniel, I think that the point that you made about sort of other things that impact the footprint is like really brilliant, especially around flying, which we know has like a huge impact on the environment. Where I might challenge you a little bit though is when you, and environmental determinism is really problematic. It's also true, we learned from Lefebvre that like space is actually produced, right? So while there are some issues that we're talking about that are not spatial, there's not a single issue where space isn't involved. So everything is socio-spatial, like there isn't a bucket for social issues and spatial issues. I think the challenge is the delineating line. There isn't always a very clear one, but there's not a single social issue that isn't grounded in a spatial context. And space really does profoundly impact our identities, and space, the character of a space, is impacted by the people and the power relations and the policy and the interactions in that particular space. So there's a lot more for fluidity maybe than how you're framing it, but I hear the complexity as well. So I tend to really, you know, ground things in the socio-spatial because those two forces are always concurrently at play.
So Dan's here trying to get us all out of a job, talking down space.
Sorry.
It's all right, Dan. It's not like it's a school full of architects you're speaking to. I'm joking, of course. I do sadly feel the need to draw us to a close. It's getting late, and I'm sure it would be amazing to hear you guys speak more. And I have something, a kind of closing thing I need to say. But first, let me say, Dan and Jay, we're not going to get the chance to go out for drinks after this or to chat and all that great stuff. So let me just say, and thank you so much. I thought your talks were amazing, and I thought the discussion was amazing, and I think you guys are amazing. So thank you for joining us. Okay, so let's see. We would like to thank our programming committee for organizing this year's series. Like, actually, it was a kind of heroic effort by Mason White, among others, and several folks who kind of really pulled all this together. And so, you know, and Nini and Aiden behind the scenes kind of making this all happen. So thank you, guys. Our next event is Ordinary Acknowledgement by Elisa Silva, coming up tomorrow, Friday, October.
Lunch.
It's a lunchtime discussion, October 16th, tomorrow, from 1 to 2. So for more info and to see the rest of the Daniels events this year, please head to our website, Daniels website, and go to news and events. We hope to see you then. And thanks again, Jay and Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really fun.
So much. It was a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Daniel.
You too, Jay. And I do hope, well, next time you're in New York and there's not a pandemic, let me know. And ditto, when I'm in Toronto, I'll let you know. It would be great to have that drink.
We will. We will. Absolutely.
We're keeping receipts.
Yes. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good night.